Hello, AP World History. This is Mr. Jack coming at you with a quick lesson of another atrocity after 1900. Today's focus is the Holodomor, which roughly translates to kill by starvation. So the Holodomor, or the Ukrainian famine, was the man-made famine from 1932 to 1933 by Joseph Stalin with the attempt to replace Ukraine's small farms with state-run collectives and to punish independence-minded Ukrainians who pose a threat to totalitarian authority. The Holodomor, according to Alex DeWall, executive director of the World Peace Foundation at Tufts University, that it was caused by calamitous social economic policies and aimed at particular populations for repression and punishment. Some background to this atrocity is that December 30th, 1922, Ukraine becomes one of the founding members of the Soviet Union. By 1929, Joseph Stalin is fully in power. He is the leader of the Communist Party, and he's essentially the totalitarian ruler of the Soviet Union. And according to Stalin's vision of a totalist communist economy, uh, part of that vision that Joseph Stalin has is to impose a policy of collectivization across the farmland of the Soviet Union. Now, collectivization replaces individually owned and operated farms with state-run collectives. So I think here often of my dad who grew up on a collective farm in the Soviet Union, where instead of his family, which had lived in this small village for however many hundreds of years, instead of getting to run the farm in the family, make decisions in the family, and support the family, you now have government mandated quotas where every determined period of time, state bureaucrats come in, collect a large percentage of what is grown on all the land in the community, taken and then redistributed amongst the general population. As you may imagine, for many Ukrainian farmers in many small villages across Ukraine, this idea that their family had worked this particular piece of land and supported themselves for hundreds of years, that way of life is now just replaced by an outside authority. So even though it is the Soviet Union, right, the perception for many people is that this is, of course, the Russian government imposing this radical new collectivization policy on them. Many Ukrainians are resistant to Joseph Stalin's vision. The Soviet regime derided resistors as kulaks. Kulaks is kind of a catch-all term used by the Soviet Union to blanket criticize people who are essentially class traitors within the Soviet kind of vision of life. Remember, in the proletariat, there is supposed to be the working class who, if they would only work together to resist and overthrow the bourgeoisie, we would achieve communist utopia. However, there are plenty of people among the proletariat who are resistant to the overarching ideas of the communist totalitarian states. Again, it's not that radical of an idea to think that, well, I would like to run my own farm and to not have the government interfere. Well, according to the Soviet vision of communism, that makes you a kulak or a class traitor. And so these Ukrainians who are resistant to this radical transformation in their lives are labeled as kulaks, traitors to the state. We initially start to see the retribution that is planned by the Soviet government, where the Soviets plan to drive resistors off land by force and deport tens of thousands of Ukrainians from Ukraine to Serbia. Now, Stalin, for his part, right, is, well, you would say, a megalomaniac with the amount of power and authority that he has as the leader of the communist regime. When he meets resistance to his vision of collectivization, Joseph Stalin is outraged and angered by this resistance of the Ukrainians. And as much as he, may like to, or he would have probably denied, is that even though under the Soviet Union you're supposed to eliminate kind of ethnic or racial or class differences, there is going to be a tension between this Russian identity of Stalin and the leaders of the Communist Party and these Ukrainians who are resistant to these ideas. So, there are a couple of proposed reasons for the man-made famine overall, right? On one, for one kind of perspective, it is easy and at least partially true to say that the man-made famine or the Holodomor was a retribution, was an act of retribution by Stalin against the Ukrainians for resisting his vision of collectivization. Another kind of idea is this idea that even though Ukraine is part of the Soviet Union, there are going to be people, as we see throughout the 1900s, there are going to be Ukrainians who are nationalists and want an independent Ukraine separated from the Soviet Union. And so, at least another piece of the argument is the Holodomor is created to crush aspirations of Ukrainian nationalism. Third, just in general, because of the radical ideas being put forth by the communists against these Ukrainian farmers, the Holodomor might just be an extreme act of repression to crush any visions and resistance um, to the communists. So, even though the policy of collectivization begins in 1929, it does not go well in Ukraine. By 1932, the Soviet quotas had missed their targets in Ukrainian farms by 60%. This enrages Stalin for a couple reasons. One, because of the initial resistance to Ukrainians, and two, the reality on the ground contradicts Stalin's utopian vision of communism. If communism worked, you wouldn't hit or you wouldn't miss these gigantic quotas imposed by the government. And so you see the kind of the reality on the ground contradicts the ideology, but for hardcore communists, you cannot accept the idea that your ideas do not work. Okay, so Stalin is confronted with this problem. So even though there are these missed quotas of 60%, there's still an idea that with proper government help, even though you miss these quotas, you can still help the Ukrainian population by distributing what was collected by the state government. Stalin does not do this. And so, what little is collected from this time period of 1932 is hidden and stored away and taken from the Ukrainian peasants, and the Holodomor begins in earnest. So, the famine itself of 1932 to 1933 stems from these decisions by the Stalinist government. So, the collectivization plan fails in Ukraine. The quotas are massively missed. The government, though, then deliberately takes policies to not redistribute food to the Ukrainian population at large. Instead, that food is stored away and taken from the Ukrainians, and there are mass arrests of farm leaders who resisted and other party members who did not meet those quotas. As further acts of repression, Ukrainian intellectuals and teachers are arrested in mass, and Ukrainian language books are destroyed. And so you get this tying in here of the destruction of Ukrainian identity as the Ukrainians fail to meet their collectivization goals. So a couple things that we see from the Holodomor is you get the central government, which does not distribute food to the Ukrainian villages when the quotas are missed. You get stories of when Ukrainians don't have food, government officials continue to come to Ukrainian farms and to search for food. If people were found hiding food, many food hoarders were arrested and sent off to prison. Other That's if you were lucky. Other food hoarders were beaten and executed essentially on the spot. So, when Stalin and the communists missed their food quotas in Ukraine, what they could do is create policies that help the people out. Instead, as an act of retribution, communists not only keep up the food quotas, which have already been missed, but they make the collections worse and more repressive to deliberately rob the Ukrainian people of food on these communist collective farms. So by the summer of 1933, some collective farms had only a third of the households left. Many prisons and labor camps were jammed to capacity. At this most desperate point is when the Stalin government eases off the government quotas and the government collections, and they import some workers to cope with the labor shortages throughout Ukraine. Now, the tricky thing is that if you look at the Holodomor and the ramifications, it is hard. You get lots of data and different statistics about the death toll by this famine created by the communist government. You will see estimates that can range from 3 million to 12 million Ukrainians. Now, to put that into kind of a bit of a perspective, if it was, let's say, 3 million people died from this man made famine by the communists, it would have been something like 11% of the population. And that's at the low estimate for Ukraine. If it was higher, you're starting to look at 10, 20, 30% of the Ukrainian population killed by the man made genocide of the Stalinist government. Today, the Soviet Union, of course, no longer exists, but the Russian government acknowledges the famine but denies that it was a genocide. Okay, so for it to be, I suppose, technically labeled as a genocide, there would need to be specific evidence that Stalin used the Holodomor to destroy ethnic Ukrainians specifically. The debate about Stalin's motives continue to be debated among historians. We know that the mass death happened, that the totalitarian megalomania of Stalin contributed to the man made famine, that communist bureaucrats from 1932 to 1933 deliberately punished, repressed, and hurt and killed Ukrainians. But whether or not it was an ethnically motivated genocide, that is still up for debate amongst historians and nations.